forest land in Eastern Washington, and I have a counterpart over there. You can see in the bottom left of the screen there if you happen to own forest land in Eastern Washington. And then we have a statewide wildlife biologist that works. He lives out in the Methow Valley, but he works throughout the entire state, and he's available for wildlife-specific consultations. As part of my job as a stewardship forester, I also know a lot about wildlife issues, but if we get down into the nuts and bolts, Ken is obviously an expert at that. So my role as a stewardship forester is to visit small forest landowners' properties, like many of you, take a walk around woods at you, help you understand the forest health and the forest ecology of your property, help you identify goals and objectives, and help you identify any management actions that may or may not need to be taken. Part of my services does involve helping landowners write forest stewardship plans if they're interested in that. For a lot of this vegetation management activities that we're going to talk about today, in certain instances, you might be eligible for funding to help do some of these activities. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is a federal agency that has a lot of money through a program called the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And part of what I do with writing stewardship plans is help you get eligible for that. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So today we're going to talk about vegetation management, and then I'm going to follow it up, like they said this Wednesday, with another talk focusing more on actual tree planting. Vegetation management is kind of an all-inclusive term, and it covers both the pre-planting site preparation as well as post-planting vegetation management. And we're going to talk about some of the considerations, like should we release trees that we planted, or is it appropriate to start over? Some of you may have seen sites like this. Some of you may have sites like this. This is basically Scotch broom and blackberries. And this gentleman here bought a tractor and was starting to mow it down. He was most definitely in the start over phase at this case here. So as we get into vegetation management, talking about site prep or releasing, why do we want to do it? Well, why do we want to control that competing vegetation? It's those first few years of a tree's life that are some of the hardest. Really, the first 2 years, I would say, the year they're in the ground and the next year are very difficult on trees. The first year, they're basically in shock. The second year, they might start to grow a little bit, but really it's that third or fourth year that we really hope to start to see growth. And in the meantime, the competing vegetation is growing like crazy. Historically, 90+% tree survival was pretty common. But as climate change is rearing its ugly head, as things are getting warmer and drier over the last several years, I'd say 5 or 6 years on many sites, we've seen a trend where that level of survival can really no longer be expected. Sometimes we're only getting 50% survival now, which might be good in Eastern Washington, but in Western Washington, that's quite low. In site prep, the vegetation management prior to planting really can help with that, right? And it involves not only the competing vegetation, but also helping to manage some of the downwood and logging slash. So with this site prep, we are going to talk about vegetation management, but the first thing I'm actually going to talk about is managing some of that slash and what we can do with that. And remember, like I said, the term vegetation management is all inclusive. Site prep is typically prior to planting, and release is typically after planting. And what we're trying to do is ensure the resources and growing space are available on the site are available for our desired species, whether that is trees or brush in some instances, understory shrubs and vegetation, and not the undesired vegetation. And at least during that first couple of years, that's critically important. And this is especially important if we're talking about native weeds. Native weeds crowd out native plants and trees due to their aggressive nature, and they reduce the habitat value for wildlife, for birds, fish, insects. They can reduce the tree health and vigor that we can see out there. They reduce growth in timber value, or the length of time it takes to get to large trees if your goal is establishing some sort of complex or old growth condition out into the future. They can slow or eliminate the establishment of forest regeneration. We're going to see that in some of the slides I'm going to show. They increase your costs, right? The cost to control the weeds. Scotch broom alone, they estimate costs the Washington economy about $140 million a year. So think about that, right? The brush is going to grow. You've spent all kinds of time. You spent all kinds of money to get these trees in the ground. We want to make sure that that's successful. So a question I get asked is, isn't brush or these understory shrubs good for a forest, especially if we're talking about the native stuff? 100% yes, most definitely. So what I'm talking about here is not having no brush, no shrub vegetation, no understory layer, but about controlling when and where it occurs. Like I just mentioned, tree planting takes lots of time, takes a lot of your effort, takes a lot of your money. And when we take this time and do it, when we take this investment on, we want to make sure that it's protected and it's done right. And later, when tree survival has been ensured, or at least as best as we can ensure it, then we can kind of allow more of this understory vegetation, which is very important to a healthy forestry ecosystem to grow and come into the system. I'm going to be pulling up the comments, I think, here, just in case. I'm actually not seeing the comments right now. There it is. There's the chat. So I just brought up the chat box in case anyone has questions while I'm going on. Okay, so what are we going to talk about with site prep? Well, first of all, we're going to talk about some slash management, like you see down there in the bottom right. And that picture was actually taken in Clallam County out towards Joyce. And they're basically piling and burning some slash to prepare the site to burn. We're going to talk about mechanical brush maintenance as well. We're going to talk about chemical brush maintenance. We're going to talk about prescribed burning, and we're going to talk about hand pulling or slashing. So we're going to talk about all those things. Some of this, again, is going to be slash management, and some of it's going to be vegetation management. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a little bit of the slash management before we get into vegetation management. And why are we doing any sort of slash management at all? Well, the purpose here is to create the plantable spots and to hopefully help minimize the vegetative competition that might come up. And I'm going to show some examples of some mechanical site prep for slash control. So if we take a look at this picture here, we could probably use a little bit of site prep. Down here in the bottom right, you might see that there is maybe a little bit of green coming up. That might be indicative of where there's some bare soil. We can get some plantable spots in there. But if you look around this picture, there's a lot of slash on the ground, and we might not be able to get trees in the ground everywhere that we want to go. The other thing is a potential fire hazard, right? In Western Washington, some of these, what we call red logging slash with these red needles here, some of these clear cut areas, these can be areas where we can really get a fire going. And there might be a little bit more of a fire load here that might last a few years longer than it might otherwise with a little bit of slash management. So this is an example of a slide where maybe we can do a little bit of slash management and help improve things into the future. So here's an example of some slash management. This is piles. And in this case, it doesn't look like these piles are going to get burned. And so that's one thing that I want to impress upon you, excuse me, is that not every pile that you build out there has to get burned. If you don't want to burn piles, you can make small, more frequent piles across your harvest unit or across your property. These provide some benefits to wildlife as well. They, Ken Bevis, our wildlife biologist, likes to call them habitat piles. And if we create these small piles all over the landscape, there are animals that'll use that, from small rodents to, if you create large piles, it could be foxes, coyotes. To build
burn piles on our property before we plant our trees.
Ooh, I got someone out there speaking. You could even get larger animals, potentially bears, if you built it large enough, right? Now, we don't do that too often, but it's potential. So these piles, you know, depending on your objectives, maybe they're too big at the base. You know, if you're trying to plant trees, a typical spacing is 10 to 12 feet. You can make it wider or shorter. Of course, it's all an average, so maybe this is acceptable. And these actually melt down a lot faster than people think as they decompose. So this is an example of slash management, is just quite simply piling it. This is an example of a windrow. So this is another example of how we can manage slash, you see windrows a lot in areas next to county roads. When you do especially a clear cut timber harvest, you create what's called an extreme hazard when you leave fine woody debris, think needles or think branches under 3/4 of an inch near a highway where sparks from chains dragging or people throwing cigarettes out might land and then start that's really fine vegetation on fire. And so a lot of what you do is you pull some of that back. So even though this isn't necessarily for site prep, it can serve the same purpose. If you look through this picture, there's a lot more green in the ground, in the foreground of that picture there. So there's probably, even though there's a fair amount of slash, there's probably quite a bit of plantable spots in there. And this slash is good, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So we don't want to manage all the slash, and we're going to see that on the next slide, and then some of the slides coming up as well. So here we are with the site prep, and maybe too much of a good thing. So you've heard probably this saying, all things in moderation. And this is an example, or maybe we've gone too far. This was actually done for forest management. This isn't necessarily done for anything else, for condos or anything like that. They really took that dozer and they pushed a whole lot of dirt around, probably compacting the soil, probably causing some erosion issues just with the machine alone, but certainly if it rains because of the compaction, they may have some erosion issues. If you look at the piles on both the left and the right of the dozer in the middle of the screen there, you can see there's a lot of pink in there. That means that those piles burned too hot. And basically what they've done is they burned the soil to the point where it's going to be very difficult for anything to grow in there. So that usually means the piles were too big, right? So when we burn piles, there's kind of a trade-off, right? You don't want to make so many piles that you're having to go and burn a whole bunch of stuff. But if you make one giant pile and try to light it off, you end up creating too much heat and actually burning the soil underneath your pile and making it so nothing can grow there. So we're looking for that happy medium. You can also see that they left virtually no slash on the landscape there. So this is good for pasture. This is good for condos. This isn't good for stewardship, and this isn't good for tree planting. The planters may like it because it's gonna be really easy to go in there and plant trees. But you know, aside from that, there's nothing good about this picture here. This is kind of too much of a good thing. This is more like what we're looking for. So this is an example of mechanically arranged slash. So basically there was no burning done on this site. They just kind of moved the slash around to provide the plantable spots, but still lots of light to moderate slash on the site. I said I was going to talk about the benefits of slash. So slash is really good. Slash provides nutrients to the soil as it decomposes, especially the fine slash, but even this larger slash as it decomposes is going to add nutrients to the soil. It helps regulate that soil temperature. So at the surface, it's a really harsh environment. It's really hot during the day, during the growing season. It can get quite chilly at night. So this can help moderate those soil temperatures and keep them cooler in the summer during the day. And the shading effect also increases soil moisture so that the baby trees that you plant have more access to soil moisture going throughout the day as well. So good slash management like this is really critical. So you have the light to moderate slash all over the unit, right? That's really great for those benefits that I just mentioned. You've created plenty of plantable spots out there. And you even have small piles. So there's a small pile up there on the hill. And then this harvest unit, you know, I'm showing you one picture, but really all over the place here, there were small piles just kind of scattered about, small enough that you could get trees all around them, providing some of those habitat benefits for those small little woodland creatures that live out there. Really a good example of some good slash management and something that I like to see quite a bit. There is no reason to burn if you don't want to. Certainly you can. But again, if it's not something that you want to do, there's no reason to do it. We can do things like this. So speaking of burning, there's that picture again from Clallam County there, up there on the left of your screen there. And this type of burning is quite common in Western Washington. This is pile burning. So this happens a lot in the spring, probably coming up here in the next few weeks to month or so, maybe a month and a half. We'll start seeing some smoke in the air from some of this pile burning. And it's also common after fire season. you know, thinking end of September into October as well in Western Washington. And if you have a lot of slash, this can be a real good way to get rid of it, right? Again, it's not something you necessarily have to do, but it certainly can be appropriate. That picture on the right might be more indicative of what you would see in Eastern Washington. This is unit burning. And in Eastern Washington, the forests there are really designed for this low intensity burning. So I'm getting some feedback. I'm wondering if someone can mute their microphone, please. Excellent, thank you. So on there on the right, again, very appropriate in Eastern Washington. Those forests over there are designed for that frequent burning. So when you burn a unit like what you've done there, you've really prepped the site good for ponderosa pine in particular, which is a common tree that might get planted in Eastern Washington. This is less common, that picture on the right, in Western Washington. Certainly in some of our prairie sites, maybe up on the San Juan Islands, some parts of maybe East Clallam and Jefferson counties for sure, down in Fort Lewis and Pierce County, maybe this is appropriate to do. But you know, in Eastern Washington, you'll see that a lot more. So that kind of concludes the talk about brush management or slash management. And now we're going to talk about the vegetation itself. And we're going to start with site prep. And again, like I mentioned, site prep is pre-planting, right? So these are the steps that we're going to take before we plant trees. And really, like I said, there's a couple of different types. You have the mechanical, which is what I'm going to talk about first. Then you have chemical, and then you have good old-fashioned elbow grease, right? Hand pulling, hand cutting, hand slashing, whatever you want to call it. Here's an example of mechanical site prep in blackberries. This is actually Western Oregon. And with this machine, you're not gonna be able to see very well. So look at that sea of blackberries. And then you're gonna be on this machine with, this is a skid steer with a brush hog attachment basically at the front. And you're not gonna be able to see much of anything. So if there are any baby trees within these blackberries that you were trying to save, you're probably not gonna be able to. So when you're at this point, when you have 8 to 10 foot tall blackberries, you look at the blackberries, they're at least as tall as the cab of that machine. You're basically in start over mode, right? So if this was planted and let go, you're going to have to plant all over again. If this is an example of something you bought, then you're basically in a restoration mode, right? When you are going to be removing the blackberries and trying to create space basically for trees to grow. So you're going to basically be cutting everything in this, right? It doesn't matter what it is, beneficial, non-beneficial, you are in start over mode. Some considerations, right? So this looks like a really nice day. That's probably a good time to do it. You know, if it's raining, these tracks can kind of muck things up a little bit. They do a pretty good job of spreading out the weight of the machine, and skid steers are rather small machines, but you know, good dry days to do this would be really good. You know, with all, especially the non-native vegetation that we have, but certainly some of our native vegetation too, you can expect a lot of this to sprout back with a vengeance. So this may be only step one of what you may have to do. But at this stage, if you look at this photo, you might be able to go in there and do some hand cutting, right? With what I call a brush saw, which basically looks like a weed whacker with a circular saw on the base. Even if you wanted to use chemicals, this is over your head, so it's probably not possible or not appropriate for you to do, right? So when you get to this stage, you've basically, your options have dwindled, right? And so we want to avoid this if we can. Sometimes it's unavoidable. Sometimes you buy into this. You know, this is one step in the right direction and starting to clear this up so that we have a place to plant trees. So now we're going to talk about site prep with chemical use. Sorry, I saw a question come up. Let's see. How about goats? So goats can be really effective. I've seen goats go to town on blackberries, either by tying them out or by fencing in an area and letting goats out in there. Goats I guess I don't consider it site prep just because it's not something that's kind of done in a forestry setting. However, Gene, it does absolutely meet the objective, right? I mean, goats are going to eat everything. I would say that goats, for the most part, you're also in the start over mode because, like I said, they're going to eat everything, right? Including any trees out there, unless you take steps to kind of protect any trees that are in there. But certainly I've seen people do it, and can be effective. If you want to make real hay with goats, of course, you got to get quite a few goats. But even a couple of goats can make a dent in it. And I've worked with people that have used goats with success before. So now we're going to talk a little bit about chemical site prep. And I want to note on this slide here that there's differences in intensity when I'm talking about chemical site prep. So here's an example of what industry might do, spraying chemicals for a helicopter. For many people, it probably elicits a negative reaction. And then we go down in intensity here. Here's a crew that is spraying what's called a pre-emergent chemical. So they are basically spraying a chemical on bare dirt. And what they are trying to do here is inhibit seedling growth, or not seedling growth, but brush growth, right? So they're trying to inhibit seed germination from any latent seed in the soil there, right? And what that's going to do is that's when we plant trees a couple of months down the road, we're going to ensure that those trees have all the light, water, and nutrients on that site. And then we go down even further in intensity with these three slides, where we're doing some sort of basal application with the sponge, like over here, where we've cut and we've sprayed on a stump, or we've done a frill or a hack and squirt method like what you see here, where we're actually targeting the individual species that we're looking to target. So chemicals can be a really good tool in the toolbox. There are different levels of intensity. What I wanted to stress upon you as much as possible is that there are regulatory requirements when applying chemicals, and the label is the law. And you're going to hear me say that a couple of times over the next couple of slides here. Really make sure if you do decide to use chemicals, which especially if you have a lot of invasive weeds, Scotch broom, blackberries, things like that, you may find that you don't have many choices but to use them. Just make sure you're following the label requirements. Typically, when you're applying by hand, the only requirement is that we don't want to spray in live water. So make sure you leave a little bit of a buffer on live water. To my knowledge, at least at the DNR level, the state level, there's no real requirement on a buffer, but we just want to make sure it stays out of live water. Certainly, there might be some local requirements that you have to follow as well. But always follow label instructions and make sure you're applying it to appropriate sites. Like I've kind of alluded to already, there are emergent and pre-emergent chemicals. As kind of the name implies, one you're spraying on leaves of vegetation to kill it, and one you're kind of spraying on bare dirt, like in the picture, to prevent weeds and plants from growing. And then we have selective and non-selective chemicals that I'll kind of talk about a little later on as well. And make sure that you don't plant too soon after you use any of these chemicals, so that you're not hurting the trees that you're planting, or that you're using it at an inappropriate time or place. So again, that goes back to really reading and understanding the label of any chemicals that you might use. And again, what I want to say is, like I said, I understand these get a bad press. They're just a tool in a toolbox. And if you don't want to use them, don't. My job is not to press any particular method upon you. If we go out there and we have a vegetation management problem and you tell me that you don't want to use chemicals, and we're going to talk about hand methods, or we're going to talk about mechanical methods to control your vegetation. That being said, at least with forestry chemicals, the vast majority of the science does speak to their safety if you're using them properly. And much to my surprise, when I went to a Scotch broom symposium, for example, last May, which had a lot of land trust and conservation organizations, and two organizations, they all used chemicals to deal with their Scotch broom, just because of the problem that Scotch broom can be. So other methods can be effective. And like I said, I'm happy to talk with you about them, but they're extremely labor intensive. And so, again, just remember it's a tool in a toolbox. And if you don't like them, don't use them. And we'll talk about some other methods. So David asked about cutting the blackberries down. How do you get rid of the roots? I guess the short answer is you're never going to get rid of them all. You can certainly try digging or pulling some of the roots up. It's going to be of limited use because when you start pulling up and disturbing the soil, you're creating a good seed bed for other whatever might be in the soil to germinate. With blackberries, they're relatively shade intolerant. So good news is if you can get it down and then just continually mow or cut if you can't dig them out or you don't want to use chemicals to kill the roots. If you're going to plant trees, eventually the trees will shade it out. So, you know, the long-term control for blackberries in areas where you're going to plant trees is to get those trees established and you can shade out the blackberries. So if you're thinking about using chemicals, I highly recommend that Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook. They have a lot of excellent information on what you can use, when you can use it, what chemicals work for what particular plant you're looking to control. Of course, you know, again, like I said, you got to read the label. So even though the weed management handbook might give you recommendations, make sure you, when you buy that chemical, you read and understand the label. And remember that if you have any trees that you're looking to protect, that a lot of these chemicals can harm the trees as well. So conifers are most at risk during the growing season, especially when that lush new growth is on the trees. So think May, June, that time frame. Generally, when we're talking about site prep, which is what we're talking about right now, we don't really have to worry about it. But sometimes, you know, you might have a few trees out there you're looking to protect. So just make sure that you are being careful if there are any trees or any desirable vegetation really that you're looking to protect, that you either give it a little bit of buffer by not spraying right around it, or using cardboard, or I've seen some people use like a piece of like wood stove pipe and put it over a tree and then spray around it, things like that. So there are things that you can do to protect the trees if they happen to be present, that you should consider if you're really trying to protect any trees that are around. So like I mentioned at my first slide for chemical site prep, we have selective and non-selective chemicals. You have the non-selective like glyphosate and imazapyr. Those basically kill everything, right? So no matter what you spray it on, it's going to kill it with a few exceptions. And then you have the selected chemicals like triclopyr and 2,4-D, as well as others, which really only go after broadleaves, maybe not grasses, things like that. So you want to read whatever chemical you use, understand what it's going to go after, and make sure you understand what the implications are for that. Sorry for the brief break. My dogs were barking to go out and it was distracting. I'm back now. And then, like I said, remember the label is a law, right? I know I've mentioned that a lot, but part of the reason why we end up with chemicals in water or damage to the environment from chemicals is because people aren't reading and understanding the label and don't know where they are and aren't supposed to apply these chemicals. So just make sure you read it and understand it. On top of these selective and non-selective, we have different types of application methods. So I talked about the pre-emergent method. That's where you're basically spraying a chemical on bare dirt. And basically what you're trying to do is inhibit growth of plants and shrubs. Then you have the foliar method. That's when you're like in the picture here, you are basically spraying on top of whatever you're looking to kill. So right on the leaves of it. You have a basal application, which would be like applying a chemical to some thinned bark species. You have the cut and dab, which would be like cutting and then using a sponge or something to kind of dab on the cut that you've made. Injection method, or you can use a combination of all of those methods as well. So let's look at some examples of how the differences between sites that have been chemically site prepped and sites that haven't right now. So this is an example of chemical site prep. This is down in Mason County. This was a few years after the planting. The yellow you see in there is Scotch broom. And I'm going to show you a picture across the street where it's nothing but Scotch broom coming up here. But you can see that there's very little Scotch broom. Quite a bit of grass coming up, but still a lot of bare dirt there, and not too much other vegetation. One of the biggest issues I see in this picture, at least in the foreground, is the trees look like they're heavily browsed. So the deer are really getting them. And I think that's inhibiting the growth here. right now at this stage, I don't think there's too much wrong with this picture. I think this is looking pretty good. If the trees did continue to get browsed, we'd want to watch that Scotch broom. Scotch broom, like blackberries, are also shade intolerant. So if we can get the trees above the Scotch broom, we can win the battle. But the question is, can we do that? Here's another example of chemical site prep. This was the first growing season after treatment. So they sprayed a pre-emergent chemical on this site, and then they planted trees. You can see some of the trees. Here's a tree planted here. Here's a tree planted here. Some of this green that you see in here is actually bracken fern that's starting to come up. But for the most part, at least for this first growing season, this is going to hit all the water and nutrients on the site are going to go to the trees, which is what we want. And due to the location, you can kind of see a power line back here. There's a county road right here. This was a hand treatment, so this wasn't flown with a helicopter here. And this is kind of the bottom of that first picture with slash management I showed you, when they just kind of mechanically arranged the slash. So this is kind of near the bottom of that. And at least for the first growing season, these trees are going to have a lot of growing space, which is what we're looking for. So this was after a fire. This was down in Mason County. This was 3 years after a fire. They probably removed some of the trees. This was a young stand. You can kind of see some of the trees in the background here. This was a younger stand of trees that was burned in a fire. And there's a ton of Scotch broom behind me. Behind me in this picture, there's a power line right away with a ton of Scotch broom. And if you look in this picture again, you see quite a bit of bare dirt, some grasses coming up. A lot of these little stumps you see here, these were actually Scotch broom stumps. And you can see that there's hardly any Scotch broom coming up, both because of the burn, but also some of the chemical site prep they did. Here's a little tree seedling that's planted. Here's another one right here. So these seedlings, again, have lots of growing space, which is what we're looking for. Here's kind of another picture of the same fire. So again, you can see this looks like Scotch broom that was here in the foreground that burned. You can see kind of the size of some of the dead trees. And again, lots of fair amount of grass, but still lots of bare dirt and lots of growing space for the trees, which is what we're looking for. So here's what it looks like when we didn't spray and we didn't really take any effort to manage the vegetation at all. This was across the street from the first picture I showed you. They planted. You can see in the background here where the larger trees are, maybe some shading or something went on, but some of the seedlings that they planted were able to establish near the back tree line. But all up in here, it's nothing but a sea of Scotch broom. And at this point, it's going to be really hard to get trees established. It's going to take a whole lot of work to control the Scotch broom here. Probably not going to be able to do chemicals, at least at first, even if you wanted to, just because the Scotch broom is too big. So we're probably talking about some sort of hand or mechanical application here just to get things back down to a baseline and then see if we can get trees established. This is down in Thurston County. The landowner here was hoping to take advantage of what we call advanced cedar reproduction. So what that means is that there was some mature cedar, and they noticed in the understory that there were some baby cedars coming up. And so they said, hey, when we harvest this stand, we're going to leave all the cedar and hopefully come up with a cedar forest. So that was our whole plan. This is 6 years after harvest now. When I showed up, didn't see one cedar out there, but I did see lots of grass, blackberries, and Scotch broom. So basically, the Scotch broom and the blackberries, which again are invasive, and one of the key components of most of our invasives is they're very aggressive, and they were able to overtake and essentially kill any cedar that was here. And now 6 years after harvest, there's no trees, and we're looking at an expensive site prep basically at this point to get this back into order for tree planting. So this is up in Clallam County. This is, again, outside of Joyce. This was a harvest at this picture. I took this picture in 2020, and this was 2 years after harvest. So this was harvested in 2018. In this picture, there's actually quite a bit of native vegetation. Looks like some big leaf and some vine maples in the back. You got some sword ferns, some raspberries or trailing blackberries. This looks like an elderberry right here. So you have a whole lot of native vegetation. They did a good job of leaving some piles around, you can see, right? So there's a pile right here in the foreground and kind of a pile in the background there. But because this vegetation came in with such a vengeance, I didn't see one tree when I walked through here. So though we do talk about the invasive vegetation being the bigger problem, if your goal is to have trees, even looking at this, that our native vegetation can really outcompete trees, right? And this might be less of a problem if we're thinking from an ecological standpoint, right? Because at least we have mostly a native plant community, some exceptions in there. But you know, still, if your goal is to plant trees and if you spent money to buy trees, you know, this wasn't successful from that standpoint. So, you know, I often get asked, you know, can't nature sort some of this stuff out? And, you know, like how much intervention do we need basically? And the answer to that question is it kind of depends. So in some cases, nature can certainly sort things out. But if nature is going to sort things out, usually it needs to be a fairly large block of uninterrupted natural vegetation at this point, because anywhere people are around, you have invasive vegetation. So here's an example of a fire in King County, or not, sorry, this was Kitsap County. And there was no site prep and no tree planting done after this. And this is a type of event that's happened throughout history in Washington. This fire happened to be small. This is an acre, maybe two tops, this fire that I'm standing in right here. We have lots of dead standing trees. Dead standing trees, what we call snags, are super critical to a healthy forested ecosystem. You know, it might seem counterintuitive to say dead trees are part of a healthy forested ecosystem, but they really are. And what would happen historically here is that you'd have a native plant community or native trees occupy this site. But instead, what's happened, because this is in kind of a neighborhood with houses and things like that, lots of Scotch broom seed around, is that this site has mostly been occupied by Scotch broom. So without intervention in this site at this point, it is going to be very difficult for trees to establish themselves. And they are trying. So here's the same fire, and here's one lone pocket of red alders that are coming up amongst this sea of Scotch broom, right? So in this 2 acre patch, we had this one spot right here that's probably 50 feet wide and maybe 20 or 30 feet deep, where the red alders won the battle. They're staying above the Scotch broom, and they're probably going to continue to grow. And in the whole rest of the site, it's just a sea of Scotch broom. And this is going to be tough. Nature can, you know, when the system is working and we have native processes working, nature can really deal with that. But Scotch broom in here is not native, and it's not part of the native process. And it invades, and it is more aggressive than our natural vegetation. And without some intervention, we're likely to have this one pocket of alder with nothing but Scotch broom for potentially decades before things finally take over. So we talked about the mechanical, we talked about the chemical. So we're going to move in here to good old fashioned elbow grease, right? So you don't want to use chemicals, and maybe you don't have access to or don't want to rent a brush hog, right? Or you're not sure if you're in that full on start over phase, which if you're renting that skid steer and brush hog, like what we saw at the beginning, that's what you're basically doing. So at that point, what's left? Well, really, it comes down to the good old fashioned elbow grease, right? So on the top right here, this is a gentleman that's using a weed wrench. A lot of conservation districts have them. I know the Mason Conservation District loans them out, and can be really good for pulling Scotch broom. Down there in the bottom left, so that's that brush saw that I mentioned. That's basically a weed whacker with a circular saw on it, and he's going to town on the blackberries there. So maybe the blackberries is in a spot where the skid steer isn't appropriate. Maybe there's trees in there he's looking to save. Maybe it's a relatively small area. Who knows? But for whatever reasons, he's basically decided to use the brush saw there to knock down that the blackberries. So if you're going to pull like in the top right there, or just by hands, try to pull when small and young before the root systems are as fully developed. Try to remove as much of the root system as possible, which I know is easier said than done. Really try to limit the soil disturbance. What they're finding more and more with pulling methods is you're basically pulling up this dirt that probably has seed in it. And so you're probably at least not making the problem better, right? It might look better for a short time. But just remember that whether you're doing pulling, whether you're hand cutting, whatever you're kind of doing, there's probably going to be some follow-up work that needs to get done, right? So really all these methods, whether you spray, whether you're using these methods, whether you're using the mechanical methods, it's probably just going to be step one, right? You're probably going to have to do more. You're going to have to follow up with that additional work. Barriers can work, such as cardboard, black plastic geotextiles, to shade out plants kind of prior to planting. I've seen it work good for grasses like reed canary grass. It could probably work for other things if you can get a good seal on it. And the tree planting presentation that I'm giving here in a couple of days, we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, or at least I'm going to show you some pictures of what it looks like, so you'll be able to kind of get an idea of that when we're planting trees. But just remember, all of these are going to require quite a bit of work, quite a bit of follow-up. And remember that when we're talking about this, maybe an integrated approach, right? So we often talk about integrated pest management, whether we're talking about vegetation or bugs, where one method alone probably isn't appropriate, but a combination of all the methods, depending on the size of the plant, the life stage it's in, the goals and objectives, it's probably the most appropriate thing, right? So kind of consider that you don't have to get hung up on just using one method or another, but all of these methods at some point during your management of vegetation are probably going to be appropriate. So now we're going to talk about vegetation management after tree planting, right? So this is, you've done some site prep, or maybe you didn't, but you put trees in the ground either way. And now what do we have to do to manage that vegetation after planting? What are some of the considerations that we have to talk about? What are we trying to do here? So again, this section is after you've planted and vegetation competition is starting to come back up. Like I've talked about, plant competition in general is this struggle, and it's this struggle to capture the limited site resources, light, water, nutrients on the site. And we're trying to make sure our desirable vegetation has that light, water, nutrients. So the objectives are basically the same as site prep, right? Just making sure that the light, water, nutrients are available for our desirable vegetation. The level of competition and its impact on seedlings can really vary depending on site conditions, the seed leaf conditions, climate variations. Like I talked about at the beginning, consider your lost revenue of the seedling costs, the planting costs, as well as your time, and the poor financial investment that equals if we've done all the work to get the trees in the ground and then we don't control the competing vegetation to the point where these trees are going to be successful. So what are some other benefits? So vegetation management shortens your rotation if you're looking for a commercial timber harvest or achievement of objectives like restoration objectives, complex or old growth forests, if that's what you're trying to do. You can get some earlier thinning for some periodic income, or to give those trees growing space to continue growing well. It's going to reduce your tree mortality. And then we'll talk about some of the considerations involving, do we release existing trees, or do we need to start over or otherwise alter our objectives? So here's a couple of pictures for you to consider. And, the question is, what do you want your young forest to look like? And on the left, what you have over there is what I would consider some very good site prep. I don't know if they sprayed the picture on the left or not. I didn't take this picture. My predecessor had taken this picture. But what I can see here is that there's very little competing vegetation. There's all sorts of down woody debris, right? So again, I talked about the down woody debris, the nutrients it adds to the soil, the decreasing the soil temperature, the increasing the soil moisture, all the benefits that down woody debris really brings to the site. And there's quite a bit there, but not so much you couldn't plant a lot of trees, right? I mean, these trees look really good in here. So this is a good example of what a young forest should look like, either if you're considering a clear-cut timber harvest, or maybe you bought one and you're trying to figure out what should you do next with your young forest. That picture on the left looks really good and is a good target. on the right is what I often see in many cases, especially if it's been neglected for a lot of years. So you can see I did circle one tree in there, right there on the right side of that picture. But basically, this looks like a lot of reed canary grass and maybe some blackberries in there. And as you look through that picture, there aren't really a lot of seedlings there, right? So again, the brush, the shrubs, the understory vegetation can come up with a vengeance and can really crowd out and take over a site with its aggressive nature. Um, so what options do you have in that picture on the right if you wanted to get your trees growing again? Chemicals might work, but you might be spraying quite a bit, right? There's a lot of vegetation in here. So maybe more than you want to spray, right? And if this vegetation is over your head, it's probably not appropriate for you to be spraying here if you got to spray over your head. Mechanical might work, like that skid steer and the brush hog attachment. But if you have a couple of these trees that are circled, are you going to be able to see them to make sure that you can protect them if you're looking to protect them? So might be your only option here is to do some hand slashing, to come in with that brush saw or a weed wrench or something like that to pull some of this vegetation out. So basically, my point is the longer you wait before intervening, you lose options. So early intervention is key to make the picture, to make your young forest look like the picture on the right, or I'm sorry, on the left, as opposed to the picture on the right. And again, there's that skid steer, right? So the odds that you see that little baby tree with that little skid steer are pretty slim, right? So again, considering your future options. So why do we want to do this? So here's a graph from OSU looking at brush and shrub versus your tree seedlings over time and what happens if you release versus don't release. So on the left, if you look at that, basically over time, the brush with its aggressive nature, and even our native brush is very aggressive at times, really starts to dominate. You can see the seedlings not over taper off, but maybe decline. So that's an indicator of mortality, right? We are losing seedlings at that point. Versus on the right, where that brush is taken off with the seedlings, and at some point we intervene and we reduce the amount of brush competition. And it doesn't matter how we've done it. So it's just as a release treatment, and a release treatment can be hand, it can be mechanical, it can be chemical, right? So it doesn't matter how you do it, it just matters that you do it. And when you do it, you can keep your seedlings growing nice and healthy, and reduce the amount of time it takes to get large trees if that's what you're trying to get to. So releasing versus altering our objectives. So here's a couple of pictures with some Douglas fir in them, along with some other vegetation. I'll start with the picture on the left there. The picture on the left was planted Douglas fir. You can see the one I've circled, and if you look closely at that picture, you'll see there's quite a bit of Douglas fir in the understory there. But if you look at those Douglas firs, like the one I've circled, they're in pretty poor condition. So the branches are kind of pointing down. To me, it looks like that circled one doesn't have as much healthy leaves, needles on it as maybe the picture on the right does. Looks like there's some brown interior needles there, not much of a leader, very tall and skinny. These trees are not good candidates for release. Douglas fir is very shade intolerant. It can only tolerate being overtopped by other vegetation for so long before it just doesn't respond very well. And in this case, the red alder's probably been there too long, and the Douglas fir just has gotten to a point where its vigor is very low. And when you have trees with very low vigor, they're not likely to respond. So with the picture on the left, if your goal is to grow Douglas fir and you say, I'm going to go in and I'm going to cut all that alder, the likelihood that your Douglas fir responds well is pretty low there. So this might be a case where you have to alter your objectives. And there's two things you could do. If you really want to grow Douglas fir, you're probably looking at just removing everything and starting over, or maybe we're going to grow an alder forest for now. That might be the only option that we have right now. And we worry about maybe planting some shade tolerance under the alder in the future. So that picture on the left is an example of maybe when you have to alter some objectives. On the right, I've circled another Douglas fir there, and that Douglas fir is looking pretty vigorous. So if you look, it's got a nice strong leader there that's got a foot and a half of growth. The branches are pointing up. The foliage looks nice and lush and green. That tree is looking pretty good, but if you look around, it's got a lot of vegetative competition. And like I said, Douglas fir can't respond or can't tolerate being in that competitive environment for very long. But this is an example of a site where we may be able to go in and cut back some of this competing vegetation, cut back some of the alder. And release that Douglas fir. So we might be able to continue to keep this Douglas fir if your goal is to grow Douglas fir with the picture on the right. So if you're going to decide to cut some alder back in order to release whatever conifers you planted or whatever trees that you've planted, there's certain times that are better than others. So when we're thinking about cutting alder, spring into summer is good. June, July are definitely the best. The research shows that we're getting about a 96% mortality rate when we're cutting alder in June and July. May's pretty good though. May, you got about 88% mortality. So May can be a good time. August is okay. You get about 70% mortality. So you're starting to get almost a third of your alder that may sprout back if you're doing your slashing, your cutting of alder in August. But by the time you get to September, you have 22% mortality. So 78% of the trees that you cut are going to come back and sprout. So really, if you've missed that summertime window, it's best just to wait to the following year, to the following May to do it. So keep that in mind, that the timing of when you do some of these treatments really matters. So are we going to let things go, or are we going to start over? Well, sometimes it is appropriate to start over, and occasionally you're going to find that what you have just isn't worth keeping, and you may want to consider that. You may want to consider starting over. There's lots of examples out there when I've gone out on sites of young forests that were planted, but unfortunately received no follow-up care, oftentimes through no fault of the current landowner, right? A lot of landowners may harvest their timber, plant, and then sell, right? And a new forest landowner comes in and doesn't really know what to do. So they've received that no follow-up care, and the result is often a site that's dominated by the brush that we talked about, the Scotch broom, the grasses like you can see in some of these pictures, or poor quality trees. And the planted trees are either dead or too far gone to save, such as some of the ones in the pictures here. And it can be expensive to start over, right? Hundreds of dollars an acre. This might be where NRCS Equip can come in and help you to get some of the share some of those costs. And if the affected area is small, you bought 10 acres and there's an acre that kind of that maybe isn't doing very well, maybe just leave it alone to develop it as is. But what if it's only your 10 acres? What if it's all of it? What do you do then? And these questions can become really difficult to answer, right? So the picture in the top right there, that's mostly a hardwood dominated forest, with some poor quality trees in it. But if it's a lot of native vegetation in there, which is what it looks like, that's providing some good quality habitat. Those hardwoods in there and that understory vegetation is really good wildlife habitat. So if wildlife is a really strong concern of yours, maybe this is okay. Maybe we don't have to start over. The same with that picture in the bottom left, right? That looks like quite a bit of native vegetation in there. And again, those hardwood forests, pretty good wildlife habitat. So maybe that's okay with you. That's something that I can help work through with you if you're interested in a site visit is, we talk about these things and we talk about your goals and objectives and if what we're looking at is appropriate for what you're looking for. The options range from doing nothing to managing what you got to starting over. And my job is to help you make sense of that. So if you have those types of questions, I encourage you to reach out to me. So big leaf maple, the picture on the right there is from Jefferson County. So, and it was from East Jefferson County. So kind of right next door. And you can see that those puffs of green are big leaf maple stumps, and they can really sprout profusely, right? A single stump sprout can grow and occupy as much of a quarter acre. So if you've planted 300 trees per acre, that's 75 trees potentially they're going to get shaded out and die. So that's 1/4 of your investment that might die. Now, big leaf maples are really good wildlife trees, but these stump sprouts rarely develop into good trees. And we find that somewhere between 40 and 60 years old, because they're bumping into each other and breaking off branches and decays getting in, that they tend to just kind of start falling apart. So sometimes they make these really giant, magnificent maples like maybe you've seen, but very often they don't. Um, so, again, what you do depends on what your goals and objectives are. Treating big leaf maple, there are chemical options, and there's some of the more targeted ones that we talked about, right? So they're the ones where you can either do a hack and squirt, where you're actually hacking into the bark and then squirting, or if you do it when the stems are small enough and the bark is thin enough, you can do a basal treatment where you're actually treating the bark itself. If you don't want to use chemicals, then basically we kind of live with some of the big leaf maple, and we try to manage the number of sprouts in the hopes that we get a better quality tree. So maybe you'd go into some of these sprouts, and instead of having 10 or 12, you'd cut back all but 2 or something like that, or 3, and try to manage for fewer sprouts that are coming up. The hope is that the tree's energy then goes into growing those 3. The reality is it's probably going to resprout again, and you just have to go back and cut sprouts consistently for a while. But the hope is sooner or later that just those 2 or 3 stems that you've chosen become the dominant maples, and then you've at least limited the amount of maple out there. So hopefully you don't have as many trees die, and you get the benefits of the big leaf maple for wildlife, which again, big leaf maple can be a really wildlife friendly tree. So again, here's those release treatments that I just talked about. So there's that basal application. You can see that's just a blue dye. All these pictures are just a blue dye that they put in a chemical. And that's just something that you put in there so you know you've treated that particular plant. So there's the basal application. It doesn't look quite like that on big leaf maple, but that's the only picture I had. It's much thinner. In fact, I call it thin line on big leaf maple. Here's kind of an example of the hack and squirt method, where they're kind of hacking down to that cambium layer, which is kind of the live part of the tree, and they're squirting into it. And if you happen to be cutting big leaf maple and you can spray the stump, that can be effective in preventing the sprouts as well. And that's, again, actually if you want to prevent it. Sometimes you may not want to. So as I'm closing here, this is the last slide. Try to anticipate challenges up front. This is especially important if you're going into a timber harvest. Look around and what types of vegetation do you have, not only on your property, but on adjacent properties or on the road. And that's probably what's going to come into your harvest unit. If you've planted trees, you can't just walk away, because that brush is going to come back. So you have to take steps to continue to protect those trees from vegetation management for at least the first couple of years. And then be honest and realistic about your capabilities. Even if you're deciding to use chemicals, which is probably about the easiest method, it is still a ton of work, right? So just be honest and realistic about what you can do, and that'll help save you some frustration as we go into the future. And then again, there's our contact information. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now, or you can feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. If you're interested in a site visit, please do so as well.
That was fantastic, Matt. Thank you so much. So folks, as Matt mentioned earlier, he's going to be giving another webinar this coming Wednesday, 3 o'clock. So please sign up if you'd like me to send you out the Zoom link to that webinar. Should be a great event. And with that, feel free to unmute yourselves, or if you want to use the chat feature to send Matt any further follow-up questions. And if there are none and you're signing off, thank you for taking some time out this afternoon and joining us.
It's like I'm getting off easy.
I guess so. Yeah, there were a few in the chat box, but I think you got to most of those. There was a question about thimbleberries, and I'm not sure if you wanted to.
That's my question. I mean, I know this was geared more for trees, but I'm picking them up at the same time people are picking up their trees. So looking for guidance.
Yeah, on removing grass. So, those slopes, that can be a tricky part. As far as removing the grass, I think what I would say is if you don't want to remove all the grass, but you're going to be planting, is what we try to focus on is a 1 to 2 foot circle around each bush that you plant free of grass. So you don't necessarily have to spray it all, till it all, pull it all, whatever you might do, but just try to get right around the bushes that you're planting clear of grass for, like I said, 1 to 2 feet, all sides.
So our neighbor had planted his portion of the bluff several years ago, and then we just bought the house a year ago. And so it seems like he had planted these bushes closer than 1 to 2 feet apart, so that he has a pretty dense hedge.
Okay. So, and how are they looking now?
They look great. I mean, there's like a, he's kept them trimmed to probably 4 to 5 feet. The idea is that these bushes have really dense, root systems that can help maintain the bluff. And so
have you talked to him to see what kind of site prep he did? Because I'm wondering if he might have controlled the grass but put mulch down or something.
Yeah, and that was, I'm going to be talking to him this week, so he may have.
Yeah, because mulch, so what ends up happening with those erosive forces, obviously, is you take the grass away and now you have raindrops hitting bare dirt and just the force of that. So mulch helps dissipate that as well. So it could be potential that he did that. Or, maybe the shrubs are just able to power through the grass.
Yeah. I mean, I had some of the snowball bushes, just growing up in my flower beds in my house in Seattle, and they were horrible to get rid of. So
yeah, they can be pretty hardy.
I'm thinking they may just be able to, that I just cut the grass down and then, stick the seedlings, in there, and they'll probably take over without. And if I plant them densely enough, then, the strong will survive. And
Yep.
But it's just sort of like when I started seeing these, like, take everything out, and I'm like going, I'm not sure if that's what I want to do in this situation.
No, a lot of times when we're talking about, and especially if we're not using chemicals, even with like a clear-cut timber harvest, we're just trying to talk about just 1 to 2 feet around each one of the trees, right? So, for the people that are still on the call, if you don't want to use chemicals in your site prep, that's the recommendation we give, because hand applications, mechanical applications, if you get more than just like a garden, basically, it gets hard fast to keep up on that, right? And so we focus the effort again, like I said at the beginning, especially if we're talking about native vegetation, that's good to have, right? We don't want to eliminate all of that. And so we just want to keep it away from our trees so that it's not competing, and get those trees above the brush. And as soon as we've done that, then we can kind of stop controlling, especially if it's native vegetation, stop controlling it and just kind of let nature do its thing.
And it's probably like a 30 to 50 foot stretch. So, keeping it keeping the grass hand clipped, between, for this season and even potentially next, isn't going to be a big deal. And these are going to be, I'm assuming, much faster growing than if I were buying a bunch of Doug fir seedlings.
Yeah, probably. A lot of our native brush is, with the grass, it's not so much the height that's the problem as just that thick mat of roots that just soaks up so much water.
Yeah.
So that's the key to kind of look for, is to make sure that those plants get a lot of water, and if you're able to do
washing it over the cliff.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's kind of you got to find the sweet spot there.
Yeah. So, okay, thanks a lot for taking time to answer my question. I'm signed up for Wednesday too, so you may see some things there too.
Excellent.
Well. So great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, looking like that might be about it.
Yeah, I think so. Well, awesome, Matt. Thank you again. And we're looking forward to Wednesday afternoon as well.
Yeah, I will be here at 3 o'clock and ready to roll.
Sounds good. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.